There is a particular kind of silence that does not feel empty, it feels full, weighted. Like the air just before a storm when everything goes unnervingly still and even the birds stop singing. You have been living inside that silence, and somewhere in the quiet, in the moments between your thoughts when you stop pretending you are not thinking about them, you feel it. Something is changing. Something beneath the surface of everything that has been said and unsaid between you is slowly, quietly rearranging itself. And I want you to stay with me, because what I'm about to share with you is not the kind of thing that lives on the surface of conversation. It lives in the deeper architecture of the human soul. Carl Jung, one of the greatest explorers of the unconscious mind, believed that the most transformative events in a person's life do not happen in the external world first. They happen in the invisible interior, in the shadowed places we rarely admit exist, in the part of the self that knows the truth, long before the mind is willing to speak it out loud. That is exactly where they are right now, in that deep, trembling interior. And you, without even trying, are the reason everything down there has been disturbed. Let me tell you something about the way the human psyche works. When it encounters a connection, it cannot categorize, cannot minimize, and cannot walk away from cleanly. The mind tries. Oh, it tries everything. It builds distance, it constructs logic, it creates stories. We're not right for each other. The timing was wrong. I am better off without this. It piles these stories like stones against a door it does not want to open, and for a while, those stones hold. For a while, the door stays shut. Life continues, routines resume. The performance of being fine becomes almost convincing. But Jung understood something that most of us spend years learning the hard way. He called it the return of the repressed. What we refuse to feel does not disappear. It goes underground. It becomes more powerful in the dark. It starts moving through us in dreams we cannot explain, in moods we cannot trace, in a restlessness that arrives in the quiet hours of 2 a.m. when there is nothing left to distract us from ourselves. That is what has been happening to them. You may not have seen it. You may have watched them pull away and assumed it meant indifference. You may have read their silence as closure. But silence and closure are not the same thing. Not even close. Real closure feels settled. It feels resolved. What they have been carrying does not feel like any of those things, and on some level, they know it. I want to take you inside their experience for a moment because understanding what is unfolding there will change the way you see everything that has happened between you. Imagine a person who has spent years, maybe a lifetime, learning to protect themselves from the particular pain of wanting something and not receiving it. Perhaps they grew up in an environment where vulnerability was punished or ignored. Perhaps a previous love taught them that opening fully was the same as handing someone a weapon. Whatever the origin, they built a version of themselves that was functional, attractive even, capable of connection, but carefully managed, controlled, never fully surrendered. And then you entered. Not dramatically, maybe not even with the awareness of what was about to happen, but something in your presence reached past the managed version of them and touched something older, something that predated all the protection. Jung would call this the encounter with the anima or animus, that deep, archetypal image of the ideal counterpart that lives in the unconscious and is almost never fully satisfied by real people. Almost never until someone comes along who resonates with it in a way that the ego cannot explain and cannot dismiss. That is what you became for them. Not just a person they were dating or connected to. You became a psychological event. You awakened something that had been sleeping beneath years of careful self-management. And now that thing is awake, it does not simply go back to sleep because they decided it should. This is not romantic fantasy. This is not wishful thinking. This is the documented psychology of what happens when a repressed part of the self finally encounters its mirror in another person. And the terrifying truth, for them, not for you, is that they cannot undo the awakening. They have tried, haven't they? You sensed it. The sudden distance after a moment of real closeness. The way they would move toward you and then pull back so quickly it left you dizzy, wondering what you had done wrong. The hot and cold, the present, and then gone. The texts full of warmth, followed by silences that lasted long enough to make you question everything you thought you understood about where you stood with them. Here is what I need you to hear clearly, and I need you to let it settle past the part of you that wants to explain it away. That push and pull was not about you being too much. It was not about you being not enough. It was the external signal of an internal war. And that war has been raging longer than you know. On one side of that war is desire. Real desire. Not the surface-level kind that dies quickly, the kind that is woven into memory, that rises in the chest unexpectedly, that makes ordinary moments feel suddenly hollow because they know something extraordinary exists and they are choosing not to reach for it. That desire has your name attached to it. It has your voice in it, your specific presence, the way you made them feel in moments they have mentally returned to more times than they would ever admit. On the other side of that war is the shadow. Jung spent decades mapping the shadow, that part of the psyche that contains everything we have rejected about ourselves, everything we fear, everything we have been told is unacceptable to feel or need or want. For them, the shadow contains the terrifying possibility of being fully known by another person and still losing them. It contains the old wound that says, if I love this much and it ends, I may not survive it intact. It contains the voice of every previous experience that taught them love and loss were inseparable, So, they did what the psyche always does when the shadow feels threatened. They projected. They told themselves the problem was timing or incompatibility or circumstance. They created a story that had nothing to do with their own fear and everything to do with reasons outside themselves. Because if the problem is external, it cannot be solved by internal courage. And if it cannot be solved by internal courage, then they do not have to be brave. They do not have to risk anything. They do not have to open the door. But here is what shadow work, the process Jung believed was essential to psychological wholeness, actually demands of a person. It demands that eventually you stop looking outward for the explanation and start looking inward at the terrified, unhealed part of yourself that has been making your decisions from the dark. That process is happening in them right now, not because they chose it consciously, because they did not. Nobody chooses shadow work voluntarily. It happens to you when the weight of what you have been avoiding finally exceeds the weight of what you fear, and they have been carrying something very heavy. Think about what it costs a person to feel something profound and spend months, maybe longer, pretending they do not. Think about the daily energy required to maintain the performance of indifference, to scroll past something and feel it land in the chest and keep scrolling as though nothing happened, to lie awake and replay a memory and then get up in the morning and act like a person who has moved on. To sit across from other people, other distractions, other attempts at connection, and feel the faint, consistent disappointment of realizing none of it reaches the same depth. That is exhausting in a way that does not announce itself loudly. It drains quietly, it hollows slowly, and after enough time, a particular kind of tiredness sets in. Not the tiredness of a long day, but the tiredness of a person who has been working against themselves for too long and is starting to understand it is not working. That exhaustion is the beginning of the shift. You felt it, didn't you? Something subtle changed, maybe in a glance that held a second longer than it should have. Maybe in a message that came out of nowhere, casual enough to seem accidental, but specific enough that you knew it was not accidental at all. Maybe it was simply a feeling. That particular feeling you have when something that was receding begins to turn back toward you. Trust that feeling. Not blindly, not desperately, but trust it, because your intuition is reading something real. What is real is this. They are no longer able to tell themselves the same story. The story that said you were temporary. The story that said what happened between you was ordinary, replaceable, something they could find again elsewhere without much effort. That story has been slowly dismantled by reality, because reality has a way of being honest with us when we are not honest with ourselves. They have looked for it elsewhere, maybe not in the way that would be obvious to you, but in small ways. In conversations that started hopefully and faded into flatness, in moments that should have been enjoyable but felt faintly absent of something they could not name. And slowly, they have begun to name it. Not to you, to themselves, in those interior spaces where truth cannot be politely redirected. They have begun to name it as you, as the quality of presence you brought, as the specific texture of connection that existed between you, that apparently does not simply exist between anyone. This is the stage Jung described as the individuation process, the point at which a person can no longer split themselves into who they want to be and who they actually are, the false self that insisted it was fine, that it had moved on, that it did not need what you represented. That self is running out of convincing arguments. And underneath it, the real self, the one that has always known the truth, is growing louder. Now I want to speak to something that I think you have been quietly wondering. You have probably asked yourself more than once, does this mean they will actually come back? Does this mean they will choose me? And I am going to answer you with honesty, because you deserve honesty more than comfort. The shift that is happening inside them is real. The internal reckoning is real. The weight they are carrying is real. But here is what is also true. Transformation does not guarantee action. A person can reach the edge of a genuine realization and still choose fear. Not because the realization was wrong, not because the feeling was not real, but because the gap between understanding the truth and living the truth is where courage is either found or forfeited. Some people stand at that edge and step forward. Some people look at the same horizon and step back. What determines which they choose has nothing to do with how much you are worth. Let me say that again, because it is the sentence that this entire story has been building toward. What determines whether they step forward or step back has absolutely nothing to do with your value. It has everything to do with their own level of psychological readiness to live in truth, rather than in the comfortable fiction of self-protection. Jung spoke about what he called the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to hold two opposing truths simultaneously until a third, higher truth emerges. Right now, they are in the tension between two opposing truths, the truth of what they feel and the truth of what they fear, and the third truth, the one that will determine their next step, is still forming. It is still being forged in the fire of that inner conflict. You cannot force that process, and more importantly, you should waim. Because a version of them that comes back before they have done this internal work will only replicate the same patterns that created the distance in the first place. They will love you from behind the same walls. They will reach for you and pull back with the same reflexes. The cycle will continue because the source of the cycle, the unexamined shadow, the unhealed wound, will still be running their choices from underneath. What you actually want, even if you have not articulated it this way, is not just them back. You want the version of them that has done this work, the version that is finally willing to stop fighting their own feelings, the version that chooses truth over performance, vulnerability over safety, and real love over the managed, controlled, carefully rationed version they have been offering. And that version is only possible through exactly the process they are in right now. So what is your role in this? Because you have one. Even in the silence, even at a distance. Your role is not to shrink, This is perhaps the most important thing I can tell you. The temptation when someone we love pulls away is to become smaller, to make ourselves easier to approach, less threatening, more accommodating, to soften every edge, to communicate subtly or overtly that we will accept whatever they offer because something is better than nothing. Resist that with everything you have. The version of you that makes yourself smaller does not pull them forward. It confirms their unconscious belief that they do not have to grow to keep you. It removes the very healthy pressure that is currently doing some of the most important psychological work this situation has to offer. When you hold your own center, when you remain whole, when you continue investing in your own life and your own becoming, you do two things simultaneously. You protect yourself from the erosion that comes from waiting without anchoring, and you become, paradoxically, more magnetic to the part of them that is trying to grow. The shadow is attracted to wholeness. Jung believed this deeply. The unconscious is drawn to what the conscious self has been avoiding. When you are fully yourself, when you are not performing smallness or desperation, when you move through your life with genuine purpose and groundedness. You represent, to the unintegrated parts of them, the very thing they are working toward. You become a living proof of what it looks like to live without the armor. And that does something to a person who is trying to figure out whether the armor is worth keeping. There is something else I want you to understand, something that tends to get lost in the anxious waiting and the analyzing and the endless loop of wondering. This experience, regardless of how it resolves, has already done something to you. You are not the same person who walked into this connection. Something in you has been activated by it too. Not just the longing, not just the pain of uncertainty, but a deeper knowing about what you are capable of feeling, about the depth of connection you carry inside you, about the fact that you are someone who can love genuinely and completely without losing themselves. That is not a small thing. That is not something to gloss over quickly in pursuit of the ending. Because here is a truth that took Jung himself many years to fully embrace. The relationship you have with yourself, with your own shadow, your own unconscious, your own unacknowledged truths, is the template for every relationship you will ever have with another person. When you do the work of understanding why certain connections shake you so deeply, why certain people can reach past all your composure and touch something primal and real, you learn something irreplaceable about who you are and what you need. This situation has been teaching you about attachment, about where you end and where the fear of losing someone begins, about the difference between love and anxiety dressed in love's clothing, about whether the connection you have been holding space for is one rooted in mutual seeing, or one rooted in the particular intoxication of being wanted by someone who is not quite sure they want you. Only you can answer that honestly. And I trust you to. Now, let me bring you back to them, because something very specific is beginning to happen in their inner world, and I want you to understand it with clarity rather than hope alone. The defenses are thinning. This is not metaphor. It is the documented psychological phenomenon that occurs when a person's repression system can no longer sustain the energy required to keep certain truths underground. Every person has a finite amount of psychological energy to spend on avoidance. When that energy depletes, and it always eventually does, the repressed material rises. Not gently, always. Sometimes it rises like something that has been held underwater for too long, fast, disorienting, impossible to push back down. They are beginning to feel that rise. It shows up in moments they did not invite. A song that was never specifically yours, but somehow now belongs entirely to the memory of something you shared. A place they drive past that holds nothing objectively significant and yet requires a specific internal effort to pass without feeling. A quiet Sunday morning that should be peaceful, but instead carries the particular ache of an absence that has not been properly named. These are not coincidences. These are the psyche insisting on being heard. And alongside the rise of these feelings, something else is emerging. A question they have been avoiding with particular care because it is the most dangerous question of all. Not Do I miss them? That question they have answered privately, honestly, in those unguarded moments. The dangerous question is this: what am I afraid that loving them fully would require of me? Because that question does not have a comfortable answer. It requires looking at old wounds. It requires acknowledging that the distance they created was never really about you, that it was a strategy learned in a context that no longer applies, deployed in a situation that deserved something different. It requires taking responsibility not just for actions, but for the emotional impact of the choice to be unavailable. It requires at its core genuine humility. And humility is the rarest form of courage. But here is what is also true. When a person arrives at that question and stays with it instead of running, when they actually sit inside the discomfort of it and let it do its work, something on the other side of the discomfort becomes available that was not available before. A kind of freedom. The freedom of no longer needing to maintain a fiction. The freedom of being able to want something openly rather than in the private, apologetic way of someone who has decided their own desires are dangerous. They are getting closer to that question. Every day they spend in the hollowness of managed distance, they are getting closer. And when they arrive there, when they actually ask themselves what they are afraid loving you would require, the answer they find may be the most honest thing they have spoken to themselves in years. What it will require is presence. Full, undefended presence. Not the performance of closeness, but actual closeness. The willingness to be seen without knowing in advance whether being seen will be safe. The willingness to offer something real without guarantees. The willingness to love someone, to really love someone, in the way that Jung described as the union of two wholes rather than the merger of two halves. That is love without armor. And for someone who has been living behind armor for a very long time, the prospect of that is simultaneously the most frightening and the most compelling thing that exists. Because when they finally clear the distance between their truth and their behavior, and I believe they will, what they will find on the other side is either someone who waited by losing themselves or someone who waited by becoming more fully themselves. Only one of those outcomes sets the foundation for the kind of love that actually lasts. Be the second one. Not as a strategy, not to make them choose you, but because you deserve a life that is full and present and alive, regardless of what anyone else decides about their own courage. That is the truth beneath all of it. The connection matters. The shift is real. The reckoning is happening. But the deepest truth of this entire story is not about them at all. It is about you, finally understanding that the love you have been seeking to give is not something that diminishes when it is not immediately received. It is something that belongs to you. It is part of who you are, and it does not require their decision in order to be whole. Let them face their crossroads. Let the truth do what truth always does, find its way through every wall eventually, in its own time, in its own way. And while that unfolds, live, fully, presently, without apology. Because that is not settling. That is not giving up. That is the most powerful thing a person can do when they are caught between loving someone and honoring themselves. It is choosing both, at the same time, without flinching. That is what psychological wholeness actually looks like. And that is what has always been available to you. Not just waiting at the end of someone else's decision, but right now, in this very breath, in this very moment of finally understanding what you are made of.